Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Hi, how are you doing? I hope that you're all having a great weekend slash start to this week. If you're new here, I make videos all about the New England region of the United States, which is the northeasternmost part of the country. And it involves 6 states: Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont. And in today's video, I am going to talk about one of many border disputes that have occurred and taken place within this region involving 2 of these New England states. And the border dispute I'm going to be talking about today includes the one between New Hampshire and Maine along the Piscataqua River, which is the river that separates southern New Hampshire, the seacoast of New Hampshire, with the southern part of Maine. And I will go through the case. I will go through some historical information, talking a little bit about the background of the case, a little bit about why this became such an issue and how the Supreme Court got involved. And then I will touch on some current day information that I didn't even know was taking place until I did research on this case. I was like, 2025? That's the year that we're living in right now. There's apparently news on this case right now. I am going to also be bringing that to your attention. And if at any point you are watching the video and you have additional information to add, because I really did try to look, especially for the current information, to see if there was anything more current going on, but the most current article I could find on this dispute in the news today was dated February of this year. So if there's any additional information that you have and that you would like to share in the comments, please feel free to do so, because that would be very, very helpful for me and helpful for anybody else that wants to watch this video. So without further ado, let's get started. So this border dispute involves Seavies Island, which is an island in the northern part of the Piscataqua River, and it is between the town of Kittery, Maine, which is in the southernmost part of Maine, and the city of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is on the seacoast right on the Piscataqua River. And the border dispute involves who owns Seavies Island. Is it Maine or is it New Hampshire? Now, originally, Seavies Island did not exist the way it does today. In fact, between 1800 and 1866, there actually used to be a total of 5 islands within that part of the river, and at some point during those years, they were all conjoined together to create this big island that became known as Seavies Island. And this island is very important to both states because this island hosts a Navy yard. It's called the Portsmouth Naval Yard. And it's actually really funny because as of today, even though it is called the Portsmouth Naval Yard, it is on that island, the Navy Yard is actually in Maine. And we're going to talk about how the Supreme Court came to that decision and decided that. So it is a little bit of a misnomer. Even though it is called the Portsmouth Navy Yard, it's actually physically in Maine, or it's recognized as being part of Maine. I think the actual physical address for the Navy Island, I could be wrong. I think the actual address is a Portsmouth address, despite being in Maine. I'll have to double check that, but yeah. So that's essentially what the island dispute is over. It's over who owns the Navy Yard. And you're probably wondering, why is that so important? I am going to get to that. So basically, the reason why the 2 states want this island and want control of the Navy Yard is because by acknowledging that the Navy Yard is located in Maine, then that means that all of the naval dockyard workers that work at the Navy Yard have to pay Maine income tax. Maine is one of many, many states in this country that impose an income tax. So obviously, if you work in that state, a percentage of your income, depending on how much you earn in a year, goes to that state in the form of an income tax. So Maine imposes an income tax. Okay. So by acknowledging that the Navy Yard is in Maine, the people that work there, despite being federal workers, because it is federal property, it's a Navy Yard for the U.S. Navy, you're still paying income tax to the state of Maine. And the rule here is that if you work in Maine at least 12 days and you earn at least $3,000, then you owe some percentage of your money towards Maine in the form of an income tax. And this includes all of the workers at the shipyard that are working at the shipyard that is physically in Maine. And the thing that New Hampshire has a problem with is that most of the shipyard, dockyard workers are actually from New Hampshire, and they commute and they go to Maine to work in the Navy Yard. So that's where it gets really, really complicated and really interesting. Normally, a lot of people, and this is pretty normal, usually will live in one state but then work in another. And normally you end up in a situation where you're living in a state that has an income tax rule, and then you're working in a different state that also has an income tax. So normally when that happens is when you're applying or when you're filing your taxes and making sure all the numbers are there and correct, you want to make sure that you let your home state know, like, hey, I worked in this border state for, this amount of days for this amount of money. Your home state will usually give you a credit on the income that you earned in another state. So you're only paying income to one state rather than two states, because that's double taxation, and that could be really, really bad for you, depending on how much money you make. And I'm sure most people sensibly would not want to pay money to two states because it's too much. Now, New Hampshire does not impose an income tax. So if you live in New Hampshire but work in, let's say, Maine, you still have to pay the Maine income tax, because the Maine rule is that even if you're not a resident of Maine, if you work in Maine, you still owe Maine money, even if you're from New Hampshire. New Hampshire is not going to ask for money because they don't impose an income tax, but Maine does. So this is the issue, that New Hampshire citizens are being exploited for their hard-earned income working in the Navy Yard, giving some of their percentage of money to Maine, even though they don't live in Maine. So that is sort of the issue there. And New Hampshire actually has claimed that this is an issue of taxation without representation. Okay? They contend that since the workers live in New Hampshire and they're paying taxes to Maine, they are being taxed without representation. But in reality, that happens all over the country. So it's just kind of weird that they're using that argument. But I'm just putting it out there that they have used that phrase, just like this same old guys that used it during the American Revolutionary War. The reason why the war started is because the colonists believed they didn't have representation, and they were being forced to pay all these taxes but had no representation in the British Parliament. So, and it's also an estimate that Maine is believed to make about $4 million to $6 million per year in taxes just on the shipyard workers alone, which is a significant source of revenue for Maine. So, of course, Maine is sitting here thinking, well, we don't want to give up the island because we're making tons of money off of these people. And New Hampshire is saying, well, it's not fair that you're exploiting our people just to make money for you. So that's really where the argument lies. Okay. Now, we have to sort of take a couple steps back and go to 1977. Because in 1977, in the New Hampshire v. Maine case that made it to the Supreme Court, because if you've read the Constitution of the United States, if you read Article 3, you will see that if a state sues another state, then the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction of the case, meaning that the case goes directly to the Supreme Court. That is what happened in 1977. New Hampshire sues the state of Maine. Okay, and in 1977, the issue was over lobster fishing rights in what is considered the littoral waters of the Piscataqua River. Now, littoral waters basically just means the edge of the coastline closest to the coast. So basically, New Hampshire is saying that, in this case, New Hampshire citizens should have the right to fish for lobster basically throughout the entire river, all the way up to where the Maine coastline starts on that other side of the river. So they're suing Maine because they believe they have the right to use the entire river to fish for lobster, and Maine says no. So in this case, the Supreme Court enters a consent decree between the two states in which they have to both agree that the middle of the river, defined as the Thalweg, needs to be the agreed upon boundary of the two states. So basically the Supreme Court says, look, you guys both need to consent and agree, sign this agreement that says the boundary will not be on the littoral waters of Maine. The boundary will be in the middle of the river, known as the Thalweg. And both of these states have to agree and sign on to this and give their consent to it. Now, the reason the Supreme Court is mentioning the middle of the river is because of a 1740 decree by King George II, which defined the border of the then colony or province of New Hampshire and York County, Massachusetts, which is now part of the state of Maine. Maine used to be part of Massachusetts. So the boundary between New Hampshire and what was considered York County, which is southern Maine, was the middle of the navigation channel, which was the middle of the river. So basically, the Supreme Court is saying, well, we're basing it off of the original documents that we have that detail where the actual border was always intended to be, and that when the border chosen by the British monarch was right in the middle of the river. And this was decided even before Maine was a state, okay? And this was something that had been respected up until New Hampshire started to, make these claims and challenges against that, saying that, well, we should have the entire river to ourselves, and then I'm going to get into why that is in just a second. But the idea is that the Supreme Court is saying this is what we're basing our finding off of. Okay. Now, as for the historical claim to the river here, okay, and Maine had no problem agreeing to this. Maine was like, yeah, sure, that totally makes sense, right? Like, we in Maine have always historically said that the river, the halfway point of the river, the middle of the river, is the border between New Hampshire and us. Whereas New Hampshire has always consistently asserted a historical claim to ownership of the river up to the shoreline of Maine, because their argument is, well, Maine became a state way after the border was set. The border was set in 1740. Maine becomes a state in 1820. New Hampshire is stating that, we've always consistently used the river up to this point without issue, way before Maine was a state. So because the border was set before that point, we as New Hampshire should have the entirety of the river in accessibility to us as our border. Our border should extend up to the coastline. Just because they happened to be there first, and they happened to become a state before Maine. So that's their argument. And the Supreme Court basically said, yeah, we're not doing that. Instead, we're going to have you agree to this case. And they actually did get both states to sign on to this, miraculously. However, what ends up happening is that in 2001, Maine is going to respond to a suit with a request to dismiss based on the principle of res judicata, arguing that the 1740 decision and the outcome of the 1977 case barred New Hampshire completely from filing another border complaint. What ends up happening is New Hampshire actually will file another complaint, like 25 years after the fact almost, in the early 2000s. So even after the 1977 case was decided, in the early 2000s, New Hampshire will then file a suit claiming that the decision was incorrect, the decision should be reviewed. And then Maine decides to respond to the suit saying, well, hang on a second, you agreed to this agreement in 1977, and by agreeing to the border being in the middle of the channel, you can't sue us again. You can't ask the Supreme Court to review this case again. By agreeing, you signed away your ability to continue asserting the fact that the border should be at the Maine coastline. So what ends up happening is the Supreme Court sees what's happening in 2001. And in fact, it was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She delivers the 8-0 decision of the court, and it's very rare that the court unanimously agrees on anything, but they all unanimously agreed on this one point here. So basically what ends up happening is they basically said that the rule of judicial estoppel bars New Hampshire from asserting that the Piscataqua River boundary runs along the Maine shore. And under judicial estoppel, it's this idea where a party assumes a certain position in a legal proceeding and succeeds in maintaining that position. He may not thereafter, simply because his interests have changed, assume a contrary position, especially if it be the prejudice of the party who has acquiesced to the position formerly taken by him. So what does that all mean? That sounds like a whole bunch of, legal jargon. What that essentially means is that because New Hampshire agreed in 1977 to settle the border dispute with Maine right then and there by signing on to this agreement saying that the border is in the middle of the river, just like King George intended it to be, because New Hampshire agreed to that in 1977, they have no right to sue Maine again to change the border. They have no right to appeal to the Supreme Court to have this, decision overturned or changed, because of this idea that they've already agreed to the prior decision. Because they've agreed to it, even if their interests change, they cannot go back to the Supreme Court and beg for an overturn. They cannot beg to be, have this case reheard. It's basically like it's like a young child making a decision, and then like, I don't know, like a week later, they're like, oh, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do the thing I was complaining about before that you told me I couldn't do. The parents then going to say, well, tough luck, Johnny. Like, I told you last week that you can't do this. Stop complaining about it and suck it up. That's kind of what's going on here. The Supreme Court basically told New Hampshire to suck it up. Stop bothering Maine. Stop suing Maine. Stop bothering us. You've already agreed to this decision. You cannot come back to us and have us rechange the decision or revisit it again, because you've already agreed the first time that you're not going to do this again. And of course, as we see, New Hampshire did not listen. So New Hampshire can now not just suddenly claim once again that the border actually goes to the Maine coastline when they agreed prior that it doesn't do that. So what ends up happening is New Hampshire will try to appeal this dismissal and request the court to reconsider the dismissal, but the court denied the motion to reconsider. Now, we enter into 2025. So how is this case that was decided in 1977 and pretty much flattened out completely in 2001, saying like, this is it, we're not revisiting this again? How does this come into the present day? So what ends up happening is in January of 2025, 5 members of the New Hampshire state legislature will introduce a House Concurrent Resolution 8 bill, which, if the bill passes, would actually call upon the United States Congress to, quote, find that the Piscataqua River and Portsmouth Harbor lie within the state of New Hampshire, and would ask the president, quote, to take such action as to designate the duty stations of all Portsmouth Naval Shipyard personnel as Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So basically what that means is if this bill were to pass the New Hampshire legislature, meaning that the House and the Senate both agree to pass the bill, and the bill becomes law when the governor signs it into law, it would call on the U.S. Congress to recognize that the New Hampshire-Maine border extends to the Maine coastline, so New Hampshire owns the entire river, including the naval yard, okay? And it also calls upon the president, in this case Donald Trump, to recognize this motion as well and to enforce it as so. As whatever executive authority he could do to impose that, that is what New Hampshire is calling upon him to do. Now, based on my research, the most recent article that I pulled up in February of 2025 states that the bill did pass the House, the New Hampshire House. I'm going to get you guys the numbers right now. The House of Representatives in New Hampshire passed the bill 250 to 123. And that is all I could find on this. I couldn't find if this passed the Senate. There was no news whether or not the governor of the state signed this into law. So my thinking is that it hasn't happened yet, because if I couldn't find it, it probably hasn't come to fruition yet. So that's where we're at right now. The bill passed the House, and unless, whenever I get an update or happen to get more information about this, I'm going to happily make a follow-up video to this, because this is just so interesting. Like, I'm just so fascinated by border disputes, especially with the U.S. states. They're just so interesting to see how, like, petty some states act, that they can't just accept that the borders just happen to be where the borders are, and that's just how things have been since literally the colonial days. But that's where we're at right now. As to whether or not this could end up happening, I don't know. My prediction is that if this does pass the Senate and if the governor of New Hampshire signs it into law, my guess is that the president is going to side with New Hampshire, and I think it's going to be more so not based on legality. I think it's going to be because he just doesn't like the Maine governor. Like, you guys need to look up the video like several months ago. I think it was like a year or more ago, where he literally calls out the governor of Maine for not following federal law and, continuing to fund certain things involving transgender athletes and stuff like that. But he totally called her out, and they had kind of a little spat on the news. So I think it's because he doesn't like her and he doesn't like Maine. I think he's just like, if it came to Donald Trump's attention, I think he absolutely would just side with New Hampshire. I even saw a joke somewhere on Facebook where someone was like, oh, watch Donald Trump just call the Gulf of Maine the Gulf of New Hampshire, which would be insane. So that's what I think. And I honestly wouldn't put it past him to do that, honestly. So, but like I said, I think he would do it more so because he just hates Maine rather than doing it for the right reasons. But that's what I have for you on this New Hampshire-Maine dispute along the Piscataqua River. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give this video a big thumbs up, like the video, please subscribe to the channel. It really, really means a lot. And if you would like to see more content like this, let me know. There's definitely more border disputes I can get into and lots more New England historical events that I can get into that are just so fascinating to me and so really interesting. But with that being said, I appreciate you being here, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and I will be back within a week or two with another video to share with you about New England. So with that being said, enjoy your day, and I will see you all very soon. Bye!